I should mention I've written 7 books on subject. At least 3 of them address apophobia and misandry. One of them is rape hysteria. For instance, the White House was just fraudulently claiming that 1 in 5 women in college will be raped or sexually assaulted. That's pure nonsense. If we look at the hard FBI statistics, it's about 1 in 12,000 for any woman in any given year. But 80% of those aren't really forcible rape cases. They're statutory rape cases. They're children experimenting in their teen years, and someone is prosecuted for violating the laws against children or teenagers having sex.
Right. So it would be like a 17-year-old who's dating a 16-year-old, and that 16 is considered a minor and 17 is considered age of consent. So if a 17-year-old boy is dating a 16-year-old girl, theoretically that's considered statutory rape, even if they're both in it. They've been both girlfriend and boyfriend for years.
Exactly. And even though it's consensual, it's still statistically scored as rape. And that's 4 out of 5 of the rape convictions that are. And then, you know, the FBI figures show very clearly that women are not very much in danger of forcible rape itself. We have statistics from the FBI that show that even the 1 in 12,000 figure is relatively exaggerated, because once a woman is outside of her minority age, her chances of actually encountering any kind of rape or sexual assault drop dramatically, about 4 times as much. So realistically, a woman in the United States has about a 1 out of 50,000 chance of ever incurring a rape or sexual assault in any given year.
Now, the thing is, A, it does happen, and B, I think what oftentimes gets lost in that particular statistic, we're not going to get too far into that right now, is that men get raped all the time. That's a statistic nobody wants to talk about, and we're not just talking about jailhouse, because jailhouse is almost guaranteed if you go in, you're gonna be held down. But I've seen more and more lately a lot of these stories that don't make it onto CNN and MSNBC and Fox News, where there are teachers in middle school, in high school, female teachers who are having sex with male students, and oftentimes that qualifies as rape. They're having sex with minors, and oftentimes you don't hear anything about that.
Absolutely. Adult women are the largest demographic for child molesting and child rape in the United States. That's probably true in other Western cultures. You never see that statistic on the media because it's literally hidden, and people refuse to believe it because of the stereotypes perpetuated by the media and also the universities.
Right. One of the other words you mentioned in the vocabulary is gynocentrism. Now, what exactly is gynocentrism?
Gynocentrism is a bit of a nebulous concept, and we can look in history going back 3,500 years and find where gynocentrism often takes hold of different cultures throughout history and becomes a very powerful tool in about the Middle Ages of Western culture for promoting violence by making men disposable in the interests of rulers who have found that it's easier to get men to act as cannon fodder if they're convinced that they're doing it for a worthy cause, such as taking care of the women and children. That's true to some extent. Many men volunteer for that type of disposability, but it's been exploited, and men are exploited now. Gynocentrism is very rampant in Western culture right now, where we devote hundreds of billions of dollars to medical research for women and healthcare for women, but only a tiny fraction of that for men. And the results are deadly. Men are living 4 to 8 years less than women. So that's what gynocentrism is favoring women at the expense of men and children, frankly.
Right. So when you see those news reports where somebody fell on the subway tracks and two guys, random guys who don't know that person, jump onto those tracks to pull them off, I imagine that that's an example of gynocentrism, where we're so programmed to jump to put our lives in danger to save somebody else. I imagine that that's part of that programming. Is that a fair statement?
That's a good example of chivalry, and men pride themselves and are within their own hearts desirous of helping women and rescuing them and saving them and preserving them. Gynocentrism is more when it becomes an institutionalized oppression of men, where it's forced on men by law and violence and a huge prison population, because the people in power gain from men's disposability. Okay?
Right.
So gynocentrism is more of an institutional tool of oppression than men's normal instincts to nurture and help others.
Gotcha. So would that be basically the example that you brought up earlier, where here in the United States, between the ages of 18 and 25, you are if you're a male, you are obligated by law to register for selective service, which for those who don't know what that is essentially you are registering for the draft. Now, would be a good example of that, of gynocentrism?
Excellent example, because men are punished by 24 line items if they do not register for the draft, whereas women are free. One of those line items, by the way, is that men cannot vote.
Right.
So that women have the right to vote, but men do not. Okay, that's never mentioned in the media or in universities or institutions. Men are actually more oppressed in terms of voting rights than women have ever been.
Right. So men, technically speaking, don't have the right to vote. They have to earn the right to vote, because if you do not register for selective service, you do not have the right to vote.
Absolutely. And if we talk about what we see feminists complaining about indignities and whatnot that are being placed on women by misogyny, and they're at a disadvantage because our culture, oppresses women and whatnot. These women have never had a draft physical or been forced. I was drafted, so I ended up volunteering for an enlistment with the Air Force instead of going in the Army. But it's not a pleasant thing. It's a great life interruption, and despite feminist claims, men are far more oppressed through institutional items like that than women.
That was one example. Another word that came up in the list when you mentioned it just now was misandry. Now, I think we've all heard of misogyny. We hear it in the media all the time. But I was having this conversation with somebody just yesterday, and I mentioned the word misandry, and they said, well, what does that mean? So can you tell us what misandry means? Sure.
Misandry is the mirror image of misogyny. We all know what misogyny is because we've been hit over the head with the concept for 50 years in the United States and Western culture. Misogyny is simply hatred or fear of women, negative attitudes towards women, etc. Well, misandry is the same thing. We were totally unaware of how much misandry there was in our culture until just recently, when the media started identifying male bashing, for instance. Male bashing is something that saturates our media. Look at the movies and how men are portrayed. Look at television commercials and how men are portrayed. It's really far worse than any of those characteristics. But when was the last time you saw the heroes that we had in the 1950s and 1960s, the golden age of television, produced in modern shows? Men are, as you said, portrayed as buffoons, as violent criminals, people who are androgynous, in other words, woman-like,
yes,
as opposed to men being themselves and producing a great deal of virtue in our culture, which they do. The common man that we even have today is probably a great example of the ancient Greek ideals of a hero. The man who gets up and goes to work every day. He's a hero. That takes courage and commitment and many, many, many great virtues that our media completely disregards.
If you enjoyed the show and want to see more, join our Facebook page called The Man Cave by Gentlemen United. All of our shows, tons of additional content, and invitations to future shows are posted there. You can add to the conversation and suggest future discussion topics. Please like, comment, share, and most of all, subscribe by clicking the Gentlemen United icon. I promise it's free. Thanks again for joining us in The Man Cave.
Enjoyed the show? Like, share, and subscribe. And thanks for joining us in The Man Cave.